throughout mid-2019, with the December 2019 release, Marvel Comics promoted the reintroduction of the X-Men into the Marvel Universe with the House of X. But why were the X-Men removed from the Marvel Comics universe to begin with? With 20th Century Fox having the X-Men film rights for the first film being X-Men released in the year of 2000 to the Dark Phoenix released in the year of 2019, this being a nearly 20-year time frame between films and everything and anything that occurred in between this time period. Marvel Comics and later Marvel Studios did not exactly enjoy the fact and reality that 20th Century Fox were making subpar films based off of their comics. Though for casual movie audiences, the X-Men films were decent in terms of success and reception. However, loyal and long-time readers of the comics whom knew their facts and situations and characters relating to those films knew that the quality of the movies were nothing like it. Originally, Marvel Comics did not think that the X-Men films would be received well from the general movie audience, and did not put much faith into the films being something of a long-term problem. Marvel did not assume that the movies would prolong the film rights being in 20th Century Fox's control. But due to the stars as Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Halle Berry, and Hugh Jackman, the early Hollywood A-list actors brought the audiences back to the films, and the money soon started to be made for 20th Century Fox. What the casual film audiences and casual comic book readers did not know necessarily is the fact that the comics actually fed into the hype for when the films were released. And the reverse also occurred in this situation, where the films brought fans into the comics. One might assume that this is entirely a good thing, but not exactly. In modern times, no one reads comics anymore. Marvel Studios later amassed huge earnings from the official Marvel Cinematic Universe, and despite the subpar performance of the X-Men films, Marvel were losing out of millions of dollars in terms of revenue from these films. With the Marvel Cinematic Universe becoming more of a success and mainstay in the film industry, and the realization that the X-Men would not be part of the first three phases of it, Marvel Studios knew that they were losing out of revenue and important aspects of storytelling for the phases of the early Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as building a loyal film base from X-Men fans into Marvel Cinematic Universe fans. The disputes between Marvel Studios and 20th Century Fox continued, as not only were the rights of the X-Men films not theirs, but of the Fantastic Four as well. This being that having the Four in the early phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe were no longer possible, in key examples not mentioned in the Fantastic Four. This meant that not having the Four in the early phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe caused slight errors in story consistency that casual movie audiences did not necessarily know about, but loyal comic readers knew all too well, such as Mr. Fantastic being a father figure to Spider-Man. This was replaced with Iron Man in the films, the Quantum Realm being replaced for the Negative Zone, and absolutely no mentions of mutants in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's films as well. Marvel Comics eventually started to marginalize and push the X-Men out of the spotlight in terms of their comics, with the assumption that if casual readers had no X-Men comics to read, then they would not be so necessarily excited to see the film's adaptations of them. This actually proved to have limited success with sales numbers released by Marvel during later years of the X-Men run. During the course of the X-Men films, sales of tickets for the movies declined, but X-Men First Class was a semi-reboot of the franchise, and actually inspired success in terms of casual reception and revenue. Marvel executives were apparently extraordinarily angry with this turnout, as Fox did not hand over the film rights as expected by Marvel Studios, and instead opted to release even more subpar films. Eventually, the decision was to have the X-Men comics abolished, with editorial decisions in 2015, and around that time having them off-world, essentially writing them out of comics. Added to that, the 75th anniversary of Marvel had muted responses from the X-Men and Fantastic Four, with Marvel being very vocal about sabotaging and destroying the reputation of both comics as well as characters related to those comics, with fans noticing this bickering between Marvel and Fox in great detail. What's important to remember is that the comics were essentially free advertisements for the films, which Marvel did not want, at least not without them getting most of the revenue for the said publicity. If someone who had seen an Avengers or Captain America film had happened to read a Marvel comic and seen the portrayal of the Avengers or Cap from those comics, it'd be nearly exactly the same. If a movie viewer had checked out an X-Men or Fantastic Four comic at the time and then seen the films, there would be exactly no similarities at all, and they would naturally be wondering and perhaps confused, why is there such a difference between the X-Men or Fantastic Four film adaptation and the comics adaptation in that sense? The viewer might get a bad impression of the comics and not want to buy future issues, while the film is just a one-shot purchase, and that's exactly what the studios want. Marvel did not want this, as the later decisions to stop the X-Men and Fantastic Four were strategic and implemented by Marvel publishers and editors. Writers were told from higher-ups in the company to not mention the X-Men or Fantastic Four at all, or just even mention characters in passing. Quote, "If you had two things, and on one you earned 100% of the revenues from the efforts you put into making it, and the other you earned a much smaller percentage for the same amount of time and effort, you'd be more likely to concentrate more heavily on the first, wouldn't you?" End quote. Marvel's then executive editor Tom Brevoort, 2015. After Marvel cut the ties of the X-Men comics, there was an undeniable void in the X-Men universe, due to the fact that originally in the 1970s throughout the 1990s, legendary X-Men writer Chris Claremont separated essentially the X-Men from the rest of the main Marvel universe by putting the characters into a small quote-unquote X-verse, and the comics remained in this small sub-universe from the time that he wrote his comics until the 1990s when he was forced off the comics. And at this time, the X-Men were slowly reintegrated into the rest of the main Marvel universe. The early 2000s in X-Men comics had editorial leadership have the X-Men characters be very public and expressive, most notably Wolverine being a member of the Avengers, when historically the character preferred to be more of a secondary character in the shadows, not necessarily in the spotlight where everyone, public or otherwise, can see him. With the loud and expressive aspect of X-Men characters, there had to be an abrupt phase so that the X-Men were not in the Marvel Universe anymore. But the work of the past decade to expose them would be hard to just erase, so Marvel decided to use the Inhumans, which were another group of superpowered individuals, in hope that casual fans and moviegoers would not necessarily know the difference with the characters. Not only were the comics not received well by readers and critics, but the Netflix Inhumans adaptation of the comics were also not received as well. A double impact to Marvel. It was clear that nearly 20 years of X-Men films by Fox were not going to just go away as simply and quickly as Marvel Studios would have hoped or preferred. In the final years before Marvel reacquired the film rights through Disney, the Deadpool films and comics were actually quite well received by viewers, critics, and commentators, mostly due to the fact that unlike the X-Men or Fantastic Four films, Marvel Studios had a bit more say with the characters and stories, so the source material, when compared to the comics, were more intact and authentic. Film critics and comic book commentators later mentioned that there was a huge demand for X-Men in the film, And by this time, with 20 years of average or subpar or maybe even horrible X-Men movies, the general consensus is that Marvel Studios could adopt the characters better than Fox, and there was finally enough momentum for Marvel to take back the rights. From the fans' perspective, it's also interesting to notice that prior to Phase 4, the only mention of the official Marvel Cinematic Universe in Fox's X-Men related films are in Deadpool due to the connections with Marvel officials. Due only to the Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox, Marvel decided to bring back the X-Men into the main Marvel universe after essentially a decade of marginalization, sabotage, and purposeful ignorement by writers and officials. Now in full position to gain profits and media exposure from both comics and film, Marvel Studios is fully prepared to once again promote the X-Men in all forms of exposure for audiences, fans, and readers.